We often take the idea of Asia for granted, but Asia is, of course, full of different languages and scripts, philosophies and literatures. It also covers huge geographical distances. So how easy or how difficult was it for the people of Asia to historically understand each other's cultures? What were the challenges of such cross-cultural knowledge in Asia? And indeed, what were the solutions that Asia's different and in many ways forgotten intercultural explorers tried to develop to overcome those challenges of inter-Asian understanding? In my new book, How Asia Found Herself, I've been asking that question. That is, how Southeast and East Asia were interpreted in West and South Asia, and vice versa. Put differently and more specifically and plainly, how were Burma, today's Myanmar, Japan and China understood in India, the Middle East, Central Asia, and indeed vice versa? I've taken as my starting point what in many ways has often been the traditional starting point of inter-Asian understanding or accounts of Pan-Asianism, the idea that Asia is one. I've taken as my starting point the famous meeting in Calcutta in 1901 between the Japanese theorist Okakura Kazuko and the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore. And it was in the wake of that meeting that Okakura wrote down his famous phrase, Asia is one. But rather than taking that claim for granted, I've instead turned it into a question, moving from the claim Asia is one, the foundational claim of Asian unity, of the ideology that will be called either Pan-Asianism or simply Asianism. I moved that from a claim to a question. Is Asia one? And indeed, I've asked throughout my book the question again and again. If Asia is one, or if Asia has been claimed to be one, this breaks the question of unity on whose terms? Who defined the terms of Asian unity? On what cultural premises and presumptions was Asian unity postulated in the 19th and 20th century? This brings me to a theme that I came up with again and again in my book. I suppose not so much a theme, but what I've discovered was a process. What I called at various points the dialectic of discovery, which is to say the interplay between projection of the self and appreciation of the other. That is, the dialectic, the interplay, the tension, often creative, sometimes destructive, between the projection of one Asian self and the appreciation of an Asian other. Over the past 10 years, I started thinking about these issues, having spent a great deal of time, many years traveling, researching, living in West Asia, the Middle East, South Asia, India, Pakistan in particular. When I first traveled to Japan around 10 years ago, I was struck at how different an Asia it was. In the terms of the Bengali cultural critic Rustam Bharucha, I'd encountered another Asia that left me deeply puzzled as to what Asia is. Over the subsequent decade then, I tried to ask those questions of not only how I or Europeans understood different regions of Asia, but how other Asians understood, in Bharucha's terms, these other Asias. I tried to develop then what we might call a methodology of inter-Asia studies. And the first point then, the premise, the foundations, I would say, of my book is trying to create a data set, a body of empirical evidence that we can try to interpret to understand different processes that we might call inter-Asian. And particularly the process I've been following my book of inter-Asian understanding, how different regions of Asia, how people, individuals and communities from different regions of Asia have historically understood one another. That data set then is necessarily a multilingual one, a data set then that formed the basis of the interpretations that I'll be sketching out in this talk over the next half an hour. I tried to then conceive then of this evidence as being part of a communicational sphere, a public sphere. Effectively, the period I was dealing with in the book is the period of the 19th century through to the middle of the 20th century, the period that saw the emergence across Asia of the spread of printing and the development, bit by bit, of ultimately an Asian communications revolution in which printing, and to a lesser extent translation between Asian languages, printing, a public sphere, a print expanded all the way from Istanbul in the far western reaches of Asia to Yokohama at the far eastern side of the continent. And I tried to understand this new public sphere through a communicational methodology of trying to recognize the different linguistic channels of this Asian public sphere of print, the geographies of this new Asian public sphere that were cited particularly in port cities such as Yokohama and Istanbul, such as Kolkata and Beirut, such as Mumbai and Singapore, all extremely important printing centers that were part of this Asian public sphere through which intercultural, inter-Asian understanding developed. And that's really important for me, because what I'm trying to understand in the book is not how perhaps one individual wandered from perhaps every single town across Asia, some notional Asian Marco Polo who experienced and understood everything of the continent. What's crucial for me is whether our notional Marco Polo wrote, printed, and therefore made more publicly accessible to other people who could read the language of the book that such a person wrote. How was intercultural understanding across Asia then made available to ordinary people, not just those remarkable individuals, the merchant travelers who were such a trope and a cliche in many ways of global history, Asian or otherwise? So the public sphere of print then was an important part of my methodology. But looking within that public sphere then, as I mentioned, recognizing that there were many different linguistic channels. Asia's communicational printing revolution took place in a whole series of different languages. And of course, a whole series of different Asian scripts and writing systems. What I was trying to detect in particular then was whether those different linguistic channels, whether there were translations, overlaps, intersections then between these different channels. The question of translation between Asian languages and printed translations of text from one Asian culture to another, and indeed whether there were dictionaries, grammars as to enable such translations, was a really important element of what I was looking for to try to understand inter-Asian understanding, the mechanisms then of translation and the transmission of knowledge then through this multilingual Asian public sphere. And of course also the question of commensurability. Not just saying, okay, there's a translation from one language to another. One of the things I was looking at least insofar as the languages I can read enable me to do so, I was trying to understand, well, what words or concepts were translated? What were the difficulties of translation? How was the Confucian canon translated, if at all, into modern Indian or Islamic languages? How does one explain a concept such as the Tao for the first time? So the challenges of commensurability, of making not just one language understood in another language, but making the cultural complex cultural concepts and indeed philosophies, how are they made commensurable? How are they made comprehensible in another language, in another cultural system with its own very distinct concepts? Without dwelling too much further on this methodology, I also found it necessary to brush aside a series of what I think are flawed paradigms that have undermined much of our recognition of how different regions of Asia have understood, or in many cases misunderstood, one another. One is the Silk Road model of continuity, as I call it, the assumption that what was known at one point, thousands of years ago, the transmission of Buddhist knowledge from India to China, just because something was known or transmitted, just because there are transmission routes of knowledge and understanding in one period, doesn't mean that those transmission routes, or indeed those texts, were known or accessible decades, centuries, and certainly millennia later. We should also be wary of the back projection of later knowledge. Much of what was known across Asia in the second half of the 20th century wasn't known in the first half of the 20th century, let alone in the 19th or 18th or earlier centuries. We must be wary then of the back projection of later knowledge, of the problem of anachronism in intellectual history, as in so many other areas of history. And finally, one of the things I was trying to do with this book is to interrogate and to question the notion that Asia is a universal, emic, sort of an internal, indigenous, an emic, or indeed a neutral category. Indeed, it's not. Of course, it is an ancient Greek word that was slowly adapted and adopted in different regions of the continent that Europeans and gradually, bit by bit, some Asians themselves came to call Asia, or Asia, Asia, and other loan words from that originally Greek term. We can see here then one of the things I started out by discussing in the book, the processes through print and translation, the printing and the translation of maps and geographical works originally published in Europe that were translated from the early 17th century, but especially in the 19th century into different Asian languages. A process that happened from the Mediterranean, in the Ottoman case in the 1600s, and from China, and particularly from Beijing through the Jesuit missionaries of the early 1600s. But again, particularly happened through the greater development of printing across Asia in the 19th century. I'll turn first to my case study then in the Bay of Bengal. And the Bay of Bengal was an interesting case study for me because it's a region that, as one of the corners of the Indian Ocean, one of the most, as it were, apparently culturally cohesive, interconnected for millennia, one of the regions of Asia that one would, judging by the second literature, and indeed just the geography of the Bay of Bengal, expect to see much easier flows of intercultural understanding. But when I turn to my evidence base, the evidence base then of printed texts in different languages, I found a much more complex picture. Indeed, the picture of learning through polemics, of polemical encounters between different religions and cultures and communities around the Bay of Bengal, that nonetheless over time developed from a pattern of polemical self-projection of one religion to the gradual, over a period of several generations, appreciation of other Asian religions. That dialectic of discovery then between projection of the self and appreciation of the other. And again, this happens not narrowly within an inter-Asian setting, but through a series of not as it were discrete, separate, self-contained inter-Asian dialogues, but through a series of wider trialogues that involve not only Europeans, but also Americans. Speaking at NYU's Global Asia Center, I was struck as I entered the building with a remarkable moment of serendipity that the building next door is a church dedicated to the American Baptist missionary who translated for the first time the Bible into the Burmese language and actually issued the first ever published printed text in Burmese, the American Baptist missionary Adoniram Judson. And there in New York, next to NYU, is a church dedicated to him, in which his son laid the Burmese Bible, rather, under the foundation stone of the Judson Memorial Baptist Church on Washington Square in New York. And that reminds us then that the interconnected public sphere of Asia in the 19th century was one, in fact, that ultimately reached across the interconnected publishing ports of the entire world, European and American, and not narrowly and self-contained Asian ports. Well, figures like Judson and other Christian missionaries were initially involved in a series of polemical engagements with Hinduism, with Islam, and indeed with Buddhism, the religions they found in the Bay of Bengal. But they also passed on to Burmese Buddhists, to Indian Muslims, and to Indian Hindus, and indeed in a range of other religious groups, the new technology of printing, and indeed the new forms of printed polemical engagements. Polemics were not new with the Christians. In polemics between different religious groups in Asia go back for centuries and indeed millennia before colonialism. But print brought them, as it were, to new, larger publics, particularly vernacular printing, and not just, as it were, the learned languages, Arabic, Sanskrit, Pali, but vernacular spoken languages like Bengali, Burmese, Urdu, etc. Well, from this initial set of, as it were, Christian missionary polemics that set off, as it were, a printing polemical revolution around the Bay of Bengal, there gradually emerged a series of other inter-Asian self-projections by which a range of Asian Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, and indeed Baha'is, having come from a new religion that came from Iran, had its first scriptures printed in Bombay because they were banned in Iran itself. And then around in the Bay of Bengal, some of the most exciting textual discoveries I made were this trilingual English, let me just remind myself by looking at the text itself. Should have put my glasses on. Yes, English, English, Persian, and Burmese trilingual missionary Baha'i texts, trying to convert then Buddhists, Muslims, and indeed anyone who read English to the new Baha'i religion. And this in turn triggered a series of local responses, of actual responses critiquing Baha'ism in turn. But what these polemical engagements involved were unintentionally, but part of an intellectual dialectic of discovery, the gathering of greater knowledge about the other, initially to criticize the religious other, but in time that created, as it were, a body of knowledge that could be used for more appreciative than purely polemical purposes. One of the most fascinating texts I found then was from 1893, which under the title Sehri Barma, an Urdu title simply meaning the journey to Burma, was actually a Muslim missionary manual. And what's fascinating here is this is a text that in which the author, Abdul Khalik, a North Indian, is describing what we would now simply call Buddhism. And yet, even though he was born around 150 miles and grew up around 150 miles away from the historical living space of the historical Buddha Gautama, the region in which the Buddhist religion evolved, Abdul Khalik had no prior concept of the Buddhist religion. Indeed, throughout his book, it doesn't even have a name for the Buddhist religion. As late as 1893, he has to describe this religion as simply the Mazhabi Barma, the religion of Burma. And yet starting from scratch as he was, Abdul Khalik, in his desire to save the souls of Burmese who were following what he saw as a false religion and a false morality, he learned the Burmese language, studied the Burmese scriptures. It's clear that that's the case because he quotes in transliterations the names of what are clearly Pali and Burmese Buddhist texts. And indeed, he has a debate ultimately with a series of Buddhists, including, as he claims, the Taitana Beng, the prelate, the chief Buddhist of the Buddhist state order that had by this point recently been challenged and deposed by the Third Anglo-Afghan War of 1885. And so what we have here is, on the one hand, an account of Buddhists converting to Islam. And yet, on the other hand, it is actually an extraordinarily rich and in many ways humane and appreciative account of the humanity of Buddhists and the details of that mazhabi Burma, of their beliefs and religions that were made available in the Urdu or Hindustani language. Within a few more years, within a decade or so, then, this process from projection of the self to appreciation of the other saw a whole series of appreciative works being published in Indian and indeed Indian Muslim and wider Muslim languages. And let me be clear, it was by no means only Muslims who were critiquing Buddhism. It was Baha'is, of course, it was Christians, indeed it was Hindus, not least the most famous Hindu of the late 19th and early 20th century, Swami Vivekananda, who was very critical of the new assertive missionary Buddhism of Anagarika Dharmapala, the great Ceylonese Buddhist missionary who was also active in India as well as Burma. And Vivekananda was very critical of Buddhism, much as he tried to reclaim it as a form, an expression of Hinduism. And yet by the 1900s, and especially the 1910s and 20s, we see in Indian, as well as to a less extent Middle Eastern languages, a whole series of more appreciative texts of Buddhism. And yet these too were not part of a narrowly inter-Asian dialogue, but patterns of more complicated trialogues. We have translations of the Dhammapada, often seen as it were the ur-text of Buddhism. Of course, it wasn't such, but in the 19th, early 20th century, it was seen as the closest thing that we have to what the Buddha actually taught. And we have a translation then of the Dharmapala into Urdu that was made not directly from the Pali, but from the English translation made by the German Orientalist F. Max Müller. We have translations of several important Christian appreciative accounts of the Christ-like Buddha, particularly the Gospel of Buddha by the German American or German emigre to America, the German theologian Paul Karus. His Gospel of Buddha was translated into a range of Indian and other Asian languages, as was the Buddhist Catechism of the American, the New Yorker, Colonel Alcott, the founder of the Theosophical Society, whose Buddhist catechism represented Buddhism to other Buddhists around Asia, as well as to non-Buddhists who were curious to find out about this religion of other parts of Asia. And indeed, no more book on Buddhism was seemingly, according to my research, more translated into more languages and more editions than Thomas Arnold's Christological depiction of the gentle and meek and good Buddha in his great poem, The Light of Asia. So again, we have this rediscovery of a lost Indian history of Buddhism, and indeed a recognition and appreciation of the Buddhist other of other regions of Asia around the Bay of Bengal, whether Sri Lanka or Myanmar. But this was happening through a complex series of trialogues and not only dialogues. By the 1920s and 30s, and indeed by the 1940s, this had actually brought up a reclaiming of the Buddha from the rejection of Buddhism in the 19th, early 20th century to the reclaiming of Buddhism. But again, that question, whose Buddhism? Buddhism was being claimed at the same time or reclaimed by the Afghan state and by Afghan intellectuals, as we can see from this stamp from 1931, depicting the Bamyan Buddhas as a part of Afghan national heritage. And by 1947, of course, the Wheel of Dharma from the Indian Buddhist Emperor Ashoka became part of the Indian national flag as Buddhism was reclaimed as part of India's national heritage. Again, that question of unity across Asia on whose terms, Indian, Afghan, or rather a Burmese, Chinese, or Japanese vision of Buddhism. While turning to Japan, this was another of the places, the regions of attempts to understand different regions of Asia that I examined in the book, trying to make sense of the South Asian, the Indian, the Afghan, attempts to understand Japan as much as the Middle Eastern, the Iranian, and the Arab accounts to understand Japan as well. And here, I'd like to focus upon not the question of religion so much as the question of language, and particularly the problem of written language, the problem of the difficulties of translating and indeed of learning not only Asia's different languages, but their different scripts and different writing systems. After all, the Japanese writing system contains within itself several different writing systems that make up written Japanese. Intercultural understanding, then, when we confront the problem of language and a written language, is truly challenging. So I started to collect my data set of a series of texts in South Asian and Middle Eastern languages, such as this account here of Japan, that we can see there quoted in the bottom. The Japanese are the diamond edition of humanity, there, which as it says in the Persian lines at the bottom from this text from 1904. Here we have a quotation from an English language text. In fact, the text, the author isn't named there, but the text is Elizabeth Good. Thanks to Google book searches, I was able to, of course, easily track the author down. And we see here what I found again and again with Japan as part of this series of trialogues, what we might think of as informational outsourcing, or what linguists, professional translators call the use of a pivot language, which is to say, time and again, I found that Indian and Middle Eastern intellectuals trying to make sense of Japan would draw on texts written in European pivot languages, whether English, French, Russian, or German. Well, I'll start off by looking at a text from 1897 by one of those figures that crops up so often in global history, the traveling merchant, one of our Asian Marco Polos. But actually, one of the things that interested me, or perhaps surprised me, in assembling my, as it were, data set of inter-Asian texts, was how very few were published, written and published by merchants. And when we think about it, that's actually not surprising, because much as merchants may well, as indeed as they did, connect different regions of Asia throughout history, of course, the knowledge that they gained of the different regions, cultures, languages within which they commercially operated, that knowledge was, of course, an extremely valuable commercial asset. It would have been extremely foolish to make that freely available to other commercial rivals in the public sphere by printing it or sharing that knowledge. That's the case with Sahaf Bashi, the Iranian merchant who turned up in Japan in 1897, making use of the new steamship networks that brought so many merchants to the ports of Japan. He didn't print his text. He wrote down a diary, but it was only actually published in the 1980s in Iran. But his text is interesting then, if not for revealing knowledge that was publicly available in the 1890s in a Middle Eastern language, there was actually rather little, but for showing an impression of Japan before the great outbreak of Japanophilia that I'll turn to in a moment, that followed the Japanese defeat of Russia, of Imperial Russia, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1945. For Sahavbashi, then, Japan was a place of moral and cultural alterity. He described the eating of sushi, what, as far as I'm aware, is the earliest Persian language account of eating sushi. Mahi kibadu chub mikhorand, raw fish they eat with 2 sticks. But this is an account of, as it were, celebratory culinary globalism. It's an account of culinary cultural alterity. In the words of Levi-Strauss's famous phrase, it's an account of le cru et le cuit, of the raw and the cooked. The Japanese are precisely so strange because they eat raw fish, not cooked food. The religions of Japan then present to Sahavbashi a kind of spectacle. He uses over and again the Persian term tamasha, a spectacle, something to behold. The great big idols, as he calls them, buts, through which some are so large one can even climb through the mouth of them. And yet, nonetheless, these are clearly idols. He doesn't have a concept of Buddhism, still less of Shinto. And indeed, throughout his text, Japan is described entirely in Islamicate terms, which is to say, terms drawn from an Islamic cultural context. There are no Japanese loanwords, or indeed a neutral word such as Mazhabi Buddha, as it will become later, the religion of Buddha, as we'll find later in Persian. This is then very much a Japan seen from the cultural and linguistic outside. And yet, during and particularly after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5, we find a whole series of celebratory accounts of Japan published in the languages of the Middle East, of South Asia, and indeed of Southeast Asia as well. But as I started to look at these texts, particularly texts published in India, a Persian account published from Bombay on the right, text published in Iran, text published in Afghanistan, the text on the left of the screen there, as well as accounts published in India, such as the histories of Japan published in Bengali, as well as accounts of Japan published in Gujarati. I found again and again a great deal of informational outsourcing, of translations from French, from German, from English, from Russian, or indeed, in a particularly interesting example, translations from Ottoman. Because of course, the Ottoman Empire was still a great imperial power in the 19th century as well. They engaged in a great deal of imperial diplomacy with Japan in this period. So much so that the Japanese government invited a series of official Imperial Ottoman military observers through to the various fronts of the Russo-Japanese War, resulting in the multi-volume Ottoman-Turkish account of Japan that was published in the early 1900s. This text then was in turn translated from Turkish into Afghan Dari, Afghan Persian. And to give us some sense, that's the text on the right of the screen there. Sorry, the text on the left. To give us a sense of how important Japan was across Asia at this time, when that translation of the Turkish account of the Russo-Japanese War was published in Kabul in 1913, if I remember correctly. It was the longest book ever published in Afghanistan to that date. So we have this great wave of Japanophilia, attempts to understand particularly the political, economic, and especially the military rise of Japan. And yet that wasn't necessarily accompanied by Japanology, which is to say this was a fascination and admiration of Japan, but it wasn't matched by an ability or indeed the development of institutions or individual expertise capable of reading Japanese text and engaging directly then with Japanese people, and particularly Japanese knowledge in its own written languages. Of course, in some cases, this was an issue of colonization, that colonized countries, such as India, didn't have their own diplomatic service. They didn't have their own, as it were, schools of Oriental studies that would crop up in London as well as in Tokyo in the early 1900s. So one of the things I was trying to detect then, or trying to understand, was how much of written Japanese, or indeed spoken Japanese, was understood in South Asia and West Asia, how much of such linguistic knowledge was in the public sphere. Were there dictionaries, were there translations, were there grammars, glossaries, or language guides? Well, I did find some. We find here the Ottoman text on the left, written by the great Siberian Tatar, Abdurrashid Ibrahim. He traveled across China and Japan, as well as across most of Asia, in fact, and published his account of the spread of Islam, of the self-projection of his own religion into Japan. He published that account in Istanbul in 1909. And here on the left, he gives a brief depiction, so much as a description, of the Japanese writing systems, labeled at the top katakana, hiragana, yamotagana, and honji. And yet the term he uses to describe this writing system is hieroglyph, as Greek a word as Asia itself, the priestly language, a Greek term that's taken as a concept word to try to explain the strangeness then of this writing system that then is as strange to the Siberian Tatar as the writings of the ancient Egyptians. We do have, as I discovered, a series of formal attempts to teach Japanese. The Ottoman Imperial Naval Academy tried to employ a Japanese language teacher. It succeeded for a few months and printed a Japanese alphabet, a basic Japanese primer, very short, but to try to read the Japanese script. Rabindranath Tagore, no less, employed Sano Jinosuke, a Japanese scholar, at his new university, his college that became university, Shantiniketan in Bengal. But Jinosuke left after a few months and actually served as a military advisor for independent, semi-independent Indian princely states instead. So there were attempts to teach robust Japanology, but they were unsuccessful for a whole range of reasons. There are also a number of language guides trying to teach, as in the case on the right, Gujarati readers, in other cases readers of Hindi and Urdu, to speak Japanese. But in the case of all of these texts, the writing or the transcriptions of Japanese words were only put into the script of the intended reader, into Gujarati, into Bengali, into Urdu or Hindi, which is to say these texts would have been very useful to try to speak Japanese, to great sort of, as it were, success of inter-Asian communication. But of course, they were completely unsuited. They're completely unable to teach anyone to read a single word of written Japanese. So again, the barriers of script as distinct from spoken language, of written language as distinct from spoken language. A fascinating case study I looked at was Badruddin Fazli, a graduate of Aligarh Muslim University in North India, who went off to teach as one of a series of about half a dozen, a series of language teachers employed at the Tokyo Gakugo Gogaku, the Tokyo School of Foreign Languages. Fazli was employed for around 18 months in the early 1930s to teach Persian and Urdu, Hindustani, the main, as it were, lingua franca of colonial India. And he was employed in particular under the direction of Gamo Reichi, the Japanese gentleman we can see there wearing the glasses, who was the professor of Urdu and Persian at the Tokyo Gakugo Gogaku, the Tokyo School of Foreign Languages. Itself established to, as it were, project Japanese commercial and subsequently colonial power across Asia. Well, Fazli is fascinating because he wrote a 2-volume account of Japan. One volume of his own experiences in Japan, the second volume, as it were, a history and ethnography, an account of Japanese culture, literature, history, arts, you name it. A really appreciative account of Japan, a really appreciative Muslim account of Buddhism by this period as well, an appreciative account of Buddhism as art rather than as idolatry in aesthetic rather than theological terms. And yet, when I try to probe the linguistic basis of Fazli's understanding of Japan, and indeed by correspondence then, the linguistic basis of his employer, Professor Raichi, and indeed his Japanese students, their understanding of India and their linguistic understanding of India, I found what I came to call a process of asymmetrical exchange. Because Fazli was, like the other Indian teachers before and after him, was expressly forbidden from trying to speak Japanese with either his students or with his employers. From his diary, it's clear that the people he spent time with out of work in Tokyo were other expatriates like himself, mostly English speakers, or indeed other Asians who spoke English, such as the Malay teacher of the Malay Muslim teacher of the Malay language at the school as well. In the bibliography that he very usefully included at the end of his book, then, he gives a long list of transliterated into Urdu, but what are actually English books about Japan, or in other cases, American books about Japan, or in some cases, Japanese books about Japan that have been translated and accessed in English. He cites a couple of Urdu accounts of Japan, but these two, when I followed up, were texts written by people who couldn't read Japanese either. And yet on the side of Gamo Reichi and his students, and indeed Fazli's students, we actually have evidence that they could not only read Urdu, but they could write it in it as well. Because published from the Tokyo School of Foreign Languages were a series of essays written in Urdu by the students themselves, as well as by Gamo Reichi. We have then a pattern of asymmetrical exchange that reflected, of course, the different, as it were, power dynamics across Asia between a colonized country, India, and of course a newly colonizing power by the 1930s, Imperial Japan. Indeed, Japanese outreach to the Muslim regions of Asia was a very big feature of Japanese intercultural understanding and Japanese power projection in the 1930s especially. In 1935, if I remember the date correctly, a Quran was published in Tokyo that was sent out through Japan's now very large Asian diplomatic network to 33 different Muslim countries. Also published in Japan was this journal, the Yani Yapon Mukhbari, the New Japanese Informer, which was written in a form of simplified Turkic by the exiled Tatar community of Japan, who became interlocutors between Japan and the Japanese imperial government and the wider Muslim communities, particularly the Turkic-speaking Muslim communities of Asia, to whom this journal was sent with its positive depictions of good Japanese-Muslim relations. All part then of this interplay between appreciation, between projection of the self and appreciation of the other. Well, let me turn finally to encounters between South Asia and West Asia, between India and the Middle East and Japan. And here he'll turn from the problem of understanding religious and philosophical traditions to the problem of understanding language, and particularly written language. Of course, there is no region on earth so densely literary with so many long-standing and ancient literary traditions as Asia. So the problem of inter-Asian understanding, let me be clear, is an ironic byproduct of the sheer cultural and literary and linguistic wealth and richness of the Asian continent. And now I'll turn by way of China then to inter-Asian attempts to understand the different histories of different regions of the great continent. Well, again, there's no shortage of people moving around Asia in the 19th century, as we can see from this map I'm showing here of the rail and steamship-enabled travels that aforementioned Siberian Tatar Abdurrashid Ibrahim, who leaves from his hometown of Tara, travels across China through the railroad system, which structures his exposure to China, as well as moving through the railway and steamship hubs of South, Southeast, and Western Asia as well. So turning to the question of history, I tried to find works written in West and South Asian, Middle Eastern and Indian languages written about the history then of East Asia, Japan, but for present purposes of China. And China was particularly problematic because, of course, as any student of China knows, China has an extremely long written historical tradition, going back centuries and indeed millennia to the classics, not least the Shijing, the Shizhi, the classic of history. So what do we find then in South Asian languages? Well, the earliest detailed accounts I've found were this text on the left of the screen, the Tarikh-i-Mamlaka Chin, a very detailed, a 2-volume Urdu work published in Calcutta. Urdu was a major language of Calcutta, as well as Bengali, published there in 1848. And in this text, what's interesting is this text is drawing upon the diplomatic accounts of European diplomats in Asia, the accounts of, in China, I should say. The title means the history of the Chinese Empire. The text draws upon the accounts of Jesuit missionaries, who of course have been in China since the late 16th century, and indeed of Jesuit and later Protestant missionary translations of Chinese historical texts, including the Shijing into European languages. And what's very interesting about this text then, of the most detailed text I've managed to find in the earliest and most detailed text from the age of print of inter-Asian Chinese to South Asian or Middle Eastern history, is that its author was an Irishman called James Corcoran, presumably working with the help of unnamed English language assistants, but nonetheless, he was the official interpreter, the official Urdu interpreter, Hindustani interpreter for the East India Company's courts of revenue. And in this account then, we have our first attempts to depict, or the earliest I could find at least, depict the history of China for the new Indian printed public sphere. And yet, as I've explained, this understanding, this Indian language, Indian understanding of Japan, of China rather, is coming through 2 sets of sources. One were these European and particularly Christian translations of Chinese history, in which the Chinese past and Chinese historical accounts have been tried to make equivalent, tried to be rendered commensurable with the biblical Christian account of creation, account of history, and indeed the biblical Christian timeline of BC and AD. And Corcoran, writing as he was in Urdu, had also made use of the series of, at that point, largely unpublished, except by Orientalists, the series of medieval Persian accounts of China as well, which had depicted China not in Christian, or you might say Christianate terms, but depicted China in Islamicate terms. So we have this text then written for an Indian readership that depicts ancient Chinese history, the history of the Chinese Empire, the title of the book, in what we can call Christianate and Islamicate terms, then reflecting then the really complex challenges then of historical commensurability, of trying to understand the history of a different Asian country, a different Asian empire and culture in the language and concepts of another region. The next text I found then was the Chinera Itihasa, simply meaning the history of China, published in Bengali in Calcutta in 1864. And here I'm grateful to a Bengali colleague here for passing me her notes on this text. And as we can see from the quotation on the front from Samuel Johnson, this was a text that was written by a bilingual Bengali scholar. And yet this scholar wasn't bilingual in Bengali and Chinese, particularly classical Chinese, of course, the historical sources, but was bilingual in English and Bengali. And so the text that was drawn on here, made very explicit in the contents and title page, was actually, and if I remember correctly, an American account of China. I may be mistaken now. I may be thinking actually of an early Bengali account of Japan. In fact, that was. But nonetheless, this too was drawn actually from, I think, a diplomatic, British diplomatic text. So we see this kind of series then of trilogues between different regions there, between whether Asia and America and Japan, or Asia and European Catholic Jesuit missionaries and China, or indeed in the text that I found most fascinating of all, the interplay between Iranians, Indians, Chinese, Italian Jesuits, and Dutch Jesuits trying to understand China. This was a text printed by the expatriate Iranian printer Malikul Kitab Shirazi, Shirazi, the king of books, a great publisher who lived in Bombay as an Iranian exile. He could publish much more freely in Bombay than he could in Iran. And he published this book, Kitab Mirat Zaman, the Book of the Mirror of the Times, Tarikh Chino Japan, through the history of China, Greater China, and Japan. And as I worked my way through this lithographic text, published, as I mentioned, in the 1890s in Bombay, something struck me. Could it be? Could this possibly be? Could it be a Persian translation of the celebrated Latin account of Japan by the early 17th century Italian Jesuit Matteo Ricci? Well, I got hold of the Ricci's text, compared the two, and realized absolutely it was, albeit cutting out all of the earlier chapters on the Jesuit missions just to focus upon the 100 pages approximately that dealt with the culture, the geography, and not actually at this point, because the Jesuits themselves hadn't worked this out, not so much the history, but nonetheless the basic chronology. What we have here then is actually a very interesting text that I managed to work out was actually a translation made by a 17th century Iranian convert to Christianity who had fled to the Mughal court, who had found at the Mughal court Ricci's, the Latin translation of Ricci's originally Venetian dialect account of Japan. He found in Delhi the printed Latin translation in the house of a Jesuit from Northern Europe. With the help of that Jesuit, our 17th century Iranian translates that text into Persian. The manuscript sits around for a couple of centuries. And in the 19th century, it's picked up by our Iranian exiled publisher, publishing magnate in Bombay, at a time when Bombay is doing quite a bit of trade with Japan, with China as well as Japan, who decides then, I'll print this text. So we actually have at this point then a text which is several centuries out of date, but nonetheless is extremely rich in detail because Ricci has famously studied the Chinese language and become himself effectively a Catholic Confucianist. So we have here then a kind of a sense sort of in microcosm in one text, or indeed of a text that has its multiple linguistic lives and multiple media in manuscript and print, in Venetian dialect, in Latin, in Persian, in print and in manuscript then, giving us a sense of the complexity then and the complex geographies and networks of inter-Asian understanding. And here too, we find not just the use of a European pivot language, Latin in this case, a dead language, of course, by the 1890s when the text is published, but also a pivot chronology of using the Christian chronology of AD and BC to describe Chinese history. We'll find that again and again in Middle Eastern and Islamic languages again. Well, with regard to China, it's not only Indians. It is certainly not only Muslims and Christians who are engaging with Japan. We have the aforementioned Ceylonese, Sri Lankan Buddhist missionary and self-projector of a very kind of reformist Ceylonese version of Theravada Buddhism, Anagadika Dharmapala, makes visits to China to try to project his own version of Buddhism into China. He's rejected through debates with Chinese scholars. We have Banu Kumar Sarkar, the famous and celebrated Bengali pioneer sociologist, who writes an account drawing upon the Protestant missionary library of Shanghai, as he explains, an account of the Chinese religion through Hindu eyes, in which he tries to make an account that the Chinese religions are actually versions of Hinduism. There are a whole series of other Indian Buddhist-based projections into Japan, trying to claim, particularly through the Calcutta-based Greater India Society, trying to claim China as part of a Greater India, which is to say China having been the recipient of Indian, aka Buddhist culture. And yet, ironically, at the same time that a series of Indian ideologues, and indeed in some cases some very distinguished Indian scholars of Buddhism, and indeed the first truly Indian sinologists, scholars of the Chinese language and classical Chinese literary and religious texts, at the same time as there's this Buddhist-based engagement with China, the attempt to try to find Indo-Chinese connections through an Indian-derived Buddhism, it's at this very moment when leading Chinese intellectuals, such as the great Chinese philosopher and educational reformer Hu Shi, pictured on the right, publishes his famous essay on the Indianization of China, in which he claims it was actually the Indianization of China, by which he means the import of Indian Buddhism to China, which actually undermined Chinese progress in its pre-Buddhist golden age of progress in mathematics, in science, in medicine, in astronomy, etc., etc. So there's this then great, as it were, debates between, as it were, what is it that is holding Chinese or holding Asia together, or indeed holding Asia, or specifically China, back. It's also then on the Indian side, Indian attempts to understand Buddhism were also attempts to understand and recover the Indian self, as much as the understanding of the Chinese other. The famous travels of Xuanzang, the 7th century Chinese Buddhist pilgrim who came to India and whose famous classical Chinese travelogue or account of India actually was laid the basis for the archaeological rediscovery of historical Indian Buddhism in the second half of the 19th century. That text was also translated into the most widespread Indian vernacular, Hindustani, in this text here, Ik Chinisiya ka Safarname, the travelogue of a Chinese traveler, the travels of Xuanzang, as it says in English script, Latin script at the top. And what we have here, as it says underneath, is a translation from the English. So here again, we're seeing this pivot language there. In this case, the translation from the English, which itself substantially drew on a French, properly sinological translation of Xuanzang's travels, that was in turn then translated into Hindustani, or as we would now say, Urdu. At the same time then, we have, as I mentioned, very well-trained Indian, particularly Bengali scholars of classical Chinese, particularly Prabodh Chandra Bagchi, who himself travels primarily to Paris to study with a series of French and Jewish sinologists before making his travels to China and Singapore elsewhere, and translating hence into French then the classical Chinese Buddhist canon, of trying to understand then the history of Sanskrit text, Indian texts that were translated into China. China then understood through Indian Buddhist eyes then of this constant then dialectic between projection of the self and appreciation of the other. Well, again, in terms of language there, in terms of finding glossaries, dictionaries, language guides in South or Middle Eastern languages to Chinese, I found a few, but here too again, there was the problem of the writing system of Chinese. So, for example, in this very fascinating text by the military surgeon Narayana Prasada, Chinizaban, the Chinese language, as he wrote in his preface, writing in 1902, Prasada declared that I've compiled this guide to the Chinese language because no such book on the Chinese language exists in Hindi or Urdu, as late as 1902. So he compiles then this set of word lists for what I presume is spoken Chinese Beijing dialect, where the soldiers were being posted, of course, in the Boxer Rebellion. Indian soldiers were posted in large numbers. But what we have here then is the ability to speak in some measure with a considerable vocabulary, modern Chinese or early 20th century Chinese dialect. But of course, the script in which these Chinese words are transliterated are Devanagari and Urdu modified Arabic script. So again, this is as with Japanese, this wouldn't allow anyone to read a single word of written, let alone classical Chinese. Again, the challenges and the barriers of language. The figure I found who I focused upon had already been studied by John Chen, an earlier scholar, but I worked through the Urdu language materials here, building upon John Chen's work, is the really fascinating Chinese Muslim, Hai Weiliang, also known through his Arabic name Badruddin Sini, Badruddin the Chinese, or Badruddin Chini, in Urdu Badruddin the Chinese from China. And this extraordinary figure from a Chinese religious minority then traveled from China to Calcutta, equipped with an English language guide that he bought from one of those printing presses in Shanghai, and then subsequently learned Urdu to such a great degree that he wrote, and this is declared by his teachers in the preface to this book, he wrote a history of the Muslims of China, an entire book, couple of hundred pages, in Urdu. That was the degree to which he'd mastered, overcome the linguistic and indeed orthographic, the script, the writing system challenges, because he's also drawing on here Chinese language texts. Subsequently, he would also write, he would study, move on to Egypt, not part of Asia, but actually a very important place, a hub of inter-Asian communications and printing. He would write in Arabic another account of inter-Asian Chinese and engagements with the Muslims of other regions of Asia. And indeed, other members of his cohort of Chinese Muslim scholars who studied in India and in Egypt also wrote books in Egypt, and in an extraordinary case, translated the Analects of Confucius into Arabic. But this work of inter-Asian understanding was published in Cairo, not anywhere within the Asian continent itself. Giving us this sense then of the complexities, the challenges, but also the breakthroughs and perhaps the unexpected figures then of the Chinese Muslims who made writing in Urdu, in Persian, and in Arabic, and drawing on their own Chinese language texts, Chinese Muslim, but also Chinese Confucianist texts as well. And indeed, through these complex interplays, we also find then the earliest accounts or translations of Taoist texts then being translated into Middle Eastern languages. And again, through these complex, not so much inter-Asian, but wider Eurasian trialogues. And in the case here of, by the 1930s, we have a series of German, particularly German Jewish or otherwise German anti-Nazi scholars who found refuge in the modernizing universities of Ataturk's Turkish Republic. One of them was Wolfram Eberhard, a German sinologist, who laid the basis for the teaching of classical Chinese and the reading of Chinese texts. He actually wrote a transliteration system from Chinese into modern Turkish. And it was one of his students, his female student, Muhadere Nebi Özdedim, who traveled to China, having learned classical Chinese, and then made her own translation of Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, the classic text of Chinese Taoism, or Taoism as it's sometimes called, bringing together then the linguistic and the orthographic traditions of China with what becomes now the new Romanized script of modern nationalized Turkish, rather than the earlier Turkish of the Ottoman Empire. And at the same period too, a whole series of histories or other accounts of India and Central Asia, as well as China, were being written in Turkish in this period. But here too, this interplay between projection of the self and appreciation of the other was very much alive as well, not least because so many of these accounts of Chinese and Indian history that were being written or translated into Turkish in this period were actually accounts of the role and the history of Turks in the Delhi Sultanate of medieval India, or otherwise in the Qing, Manchu, or even earlier Karahanid, for example, Chinese empires. Again, the interplay between projection of the Turkish self and appreciation of the historical past of the Chinese and Indian other. Well, as I draw to a close then, I'll just point to my broader findings, which we're recognizing then by looking at a data set of several hundred texts, primary sources, recognizing the challenges of inter-Asian understanding, recognizing the limits of an ideology, or at least an assumption, that in Akakoda's famous words, Asia is one, and turning methodologically from that assumption or that declaration, Asia is one, to thinking, is Asia one? How is Asia one? How were different regions of Asia understood, experienced, described for other Asian people, the majority, of course, who stayed at home? And finally, then, recognizing this dialectic of discovery between appreciation of the self, projection of the self and appreciation of the other, recognizing that this dialectic came about not only through narrowly inter-Asian dialogues, but through more complex Eurasian trialogues in which the participants in this process of inter-Asian cross-cultural understanding might well be long-deceased Italian Jesuits as much as living people from other regions of the Asian continent itself. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I'll just finish off by pointing to the end point, I guess, of my book and the story I've been describing here in 1947, when Jawaharlal Nehru called his famous Asian Relations Conference, in which he declared in a famous speech that then at the end of empire, Asia is again finding herself. I took this famous phrase for the title of my book, How Asia Found Herself, but again, moving from that declaration to a question. And if nothing else, through my book, How Asia Found Herself, I hope to have provoked a set of questions and further research by other, no doubt more competent scholars than myself, in trying to understand that question and that series of complex processes through which Asia found herself in the modern period. Thank you for listening.